On from our discussion about yarn, we're going to talk about needles as the second part of Essential Kit. In terms of needles, we're going to talk first about needle size. So needle size doesn't refer to the length of the needle, it refers to the diameter of the needle. So the thickness of the needle essentially. So this is a 2.5 mil needle. Needles come in many different sizes, as illustrated by this. This is a needle gauge and it shows you all of the sizes all the way from a 2 mil to a 10 mil. And it actually goes down lower and then it goes further up as well. So you can go from anything from a 1.5 is the smallest I've seen, right up to all sorts of big chunky needles. Just to show you the difference, this is a 2.5, this is a 9 mil, and this one is a 20 mil needle that I use for chunky yarns. And you can see the difference between them, and that has a profound impact on the size of the stitch that you're going to get when you knit with those needles. The needle size that you choose is going to be based on the pattern that you're making, the yarn that you're using, and a number of other factors. So after discussing the size of needle, the next is the type of needle. So these are straight needles, and they are capped at one end, and that keeps the stitches on, and you can see the sizes of those needles there. They're the most commonly associated with knitting, and they are used mostly for working flat. The next needle we're going to talk about is a circular needle. A circular needle is two tips joined together by a flexible cable. So you can see your needle tips there, and there's a cable, and that cable can vary in length, but we'll talk about lengths in a minute. So here you can see that you can knit back and forth or in the round with these needles as if you were working with straight needles. So these are kind of multi-purpose needles, so you can work back and forth or you can work in the round. The original and best knitting needles are the double pointed needles. So these come in sets of 4 or 5. I recommend buying them in sets of 5, and these are most often used for working small circumferences in the round. Prior to the arrival of circular needles, it was quite common to buy them in much longer sizes for doing bigger circumferences in the round, but that's less commonly the case now. And you can see that there are tips on both ends. And from the oldest needle to the newest needle, these are trios. This is an Addi brand, but there are made a number of brands make them. They're also for working small circumferences in the round, and for some people they're a really good alternative to DPNs. The next consideration when buying needles is the length of needles. As you can see here, I have 2 pairs of straight needles, but there's a 10 centimeter difference in them. That matters because you'll be able to get more stitches on your needle, so the bigger the project you're using, the longer the needle you will require. That's the case with straight needles. So in addition to that, double pointed needles also come in a variety of sizes. I've seen them as small as 10 centimeters, and I've recently seen a pair advertised for 10 inches. And that was what I was saying earlier about how sometimes they are used for very large circumferences in the round, even though that is less common now. Probably the most variation in length is what you see from circular needles. So circular needle sizes refers to the tip-to-tip measurement of the needle. It's not just the cable is included in that. And they start at very small, so 20 centimeters, and they go all the way up to 150. And you can find them even longer because there are now tools for joining those together. It's very important when you're working in the round particularly that you get the right length of circular needle. You'll also see in these that there are a variation in the tip lengths as well, and that can affect how easy they are to work, particularly in smaller circumferences. And you can also see that there's variation in lengths, and this is an Addi sock wonder, so specifically designed for socks. An interesting thing about circular needles is that you can buy them in interchangeable sets, which allows you to buy cables of different lengths and different sets of tips. And your tips are added to your cables to make different lengths of needle depending on what you're using them for. They're definitely worth looking at if you do a lot of knitting and can be a great investment. While length, size and type are something that you will see specified in patterns, something that won't matter as much, is more of a personal preference, is the composition or the materials used to make the needles. So these are 2 different types of metal needle. And I think many of us will be very familiar with the silver needles because they're certainly the types of needles that I knit on. I haven't used those in quite a while. They're not my go-to needle material anymore. You can also buy a lot of different types of wooden needles. So you can get rosewood, bamboo, and many other different types depending on the brand. And the type of material that you choose for the needles that you use will really determine, is really a personal preference. I really like wooden needles for some things and I like metal needles for others. Another thing to be aware of when you're buying needles is the type of tips that the needle has. So you will see on the left the metal needles and on the right the wooden needles. There is a slightly difference in the way the needle is tapered. And I mention this because this is something that you will get an affinity to over time. So there's kind of the Goldilocks point that everybody has with needles. So I like mine quite sharp, but not cutting your skin sharp. No discussion of essential kit would be finished without talking about scissors, darning needles and measuring tapes, all of which are really, really important when you're knitting. So, like most things in knitting, they all come in different sizes. So here I have two different rulers. I use a rigid ruler for when I am measuring my gauge swatches or if I'm measuring maybe my foot. I use my fabrics for measuring myself or if I'm measuring a large garment. You get those as well in different lengths. So I have the orange one that I have there is actually a curtain measuring tape. And that is 300 centimeters in length. I find that it's probably a bit excessive, but sometimes it's quite useful. The other measuring tape is a little bit more realistic, and it's a tailor's measuring tape, and it's 150 centimeters. No knitter's kit is finished without having at least one really sharp scissors for trimming your ends and for snipping your yarn. The other item which you definitely need is darning needles. And again, like everything, they come in different sizes. So you have the really small one, which you would use for, say, a lace weight yarn. So that's a really quite a fine needle. And then again, they're in ever increasing sizes. You will notice that all of these are bent tipped darning needles, and that is because I really like them and I prefer to use those than a straight darning needle because I find it easier to scoop the yarn when I am either mattress stitching or if I am seaming or if I'm doing anything at all like that that requires me to use a darning needle. I much prefer to use a curved tip darning needle. And there you have it. That is all of your essential kit.